The county auctioneer had called it solid construction. That was the phrase in the listing: solid construction, good bones, original outbuildings intact. The language of a sale description written by someone who had walked through a property quickly and noted what could be noted without looking too carefully at anything. Nora Breck had read the listing twice the way she read everything twice, and had driven out to Crestfall Farm on a Tuesday afternoon before the auction to walk the property herself. She was 68 years old, and she had spent 40 years as a school librarian, and she had developed in that time a specific relationship with the gap between how things were described and what they actually were. Catalog descriptions were written by people with reasons to simplify. The actual item was always more complicated. The farmhouse was substantial white clapboard, 2 stories, the kind of construction that spoke to a family with enough resources and enough intention to build for generations. The foundation was dressed stone, the kind laid in the 1890s by people who understood that a foundation was not the part of a building you economized on. The barn at the western edge of the property had the same quality, built to last, built to work, built by people who intended to be here. The Whitmore family had been here from 1891. And then in 1959, they hadn't been. No forwarding address filed with the county, no public explanation, no sale. The property had simply been left, the taxes paid forward for 5 years by what appeared in the county records to be an automatic arrangement, and then not paid, and then lapsed into the county's possession through the standard process of a property abandoned without resolution. A family that had farmed the same land for 68 years had walked away in a single season and had not come back, and had not explained why. Nora had noted this in her research before the auction and had not resolved it because some things did not resolve from public records alone. She had bid on the property anyway because the structure was sound and the land was good, and 40 years of library work had given her a tolerance for questions that did not yet have answers. She had won the auction for a number that reflected the property's complicated history more than its actual quality. She had been inside for 3 days when she found the basement. The access was through the kitchen, a standard basement door, the stairs steep and narrow, the construction original to the house. She had descended on her first day and had noted the stone foundation walls, the packed earth floor, the cold that came from depth rather than season, and had moved on. The basement was what a basement in a farmhouse of this age and construction should be: storage, cold preservation, the functional underpinning of a working farm. She had come back on the 3rd day with her measuring tape. 40 years of cataloging had given her a habit she could not turn off. She noticed when things did not correspond to what they should be. The basement felt shorter than the house above it. Not dramatically, she would not have noticed it on a casual walkthrough. But she had been measuring the ground floor, systematically recording the dimensions of each room for the structural assessment, and when she descended the basement stairs and paced the length of the space, the number she wrote in her notepad did not match the number she had written for the floor above. The basement was approximately 9 feet shorter than the kitchen directly above it. She stood in the basement with her flashlight and looked at the north wall. Stone throughout, the same rough field stone as the other 3 walls, the construction consistent with the 1890s foundation, except that it wasn't consistent, not entirely. She walked to the north wall and held the flashlight along its surface and looked at it the way she looked at any unfamiliar material, not for what she expected to see, but for what was actually there. The stone on the left 2/3 of the wall was original. She could see it in the character of the construction, the irregular field stone, the lime mortar, the particular gray of stone that had been in place for more than a century and had settled into its position. The stone on the right 1/3 was different, slightly smoother, the mortar a different color, a different composition, the courses slightly more regular, laid with a more deliberate hand, not original construction, added later. Perhaps 30 years after the original foundation, judging from the material character, sometime in the 1920s or 1930s. She ran her fingers along the joint between the 2 sections of wall. Pressed gently. The newer section was solid, well built, the construction of someone who knew what they were doing. It did not flex, did not suggest any structural weakness. It had been built to hold. She counted the courses of the newer section. 32 courses high, 22 courses wide. She was counting the lowest course, moving her flashlight along the base of the wall when she found it. Near the bottom right corner where the newer stonework met the original foundation at its lowest course, a single stone, approximately 8 inches by 4, the surface slightly smoother than the stones around it, as if it had been touched more than the others, and pressed into the dried mortar beside it, not cut into the stone itself, but into the mortar joint where 2 stones met a small X. She crouched and looked at it closely. Not a mason's mark, those were typically on the stone face itself, and they served a functional purpose she would have recognized. This was in the mortar at the joint cut with something narrow and pointed after the mortar had dried, cut deliberately and precisely, the strokes clean, the size consistent, perhaps a 1/4 inch across. Too small to be decorative, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had marked this stone after the wall was finished, had come back to the finished wall and had pressed a small X into the dried mortar at the lower right corner where someone looking carefully at the base of the wall in good light would find it, where someone would know where to begin. Nora sat back on her heels in the basement of Crestfall Farm and looked at the X in the mortar and understood with the particular certainty that came from 40 years of finding things that had been filed under the wrong heading that the basement was not 9 feet shorter than the kitchen above it because of a measurement error or a construction anomaly. It was 9 feet shorter because someone had built a wall across it, and someone had marked where to start taking it apart. She had won the auction on a Thursday morning in September. Not because no one else wanted Crestfall Farm. 3 other bidders had been in the room, each of them assessing the property with the practical eye of people who were interested in the land or the structure or both. Nora had assessed it differently. She had spent the previous 2 weeks in the County Historical Records Office reading everything available about the Whitmore family and their 68 years on this land, and she had come to the auction with questions that a winning bid was the only way to pursue further. The property had been in the county's possession for 31 years. The Whitmores had stopped paying taxes in 1964, 5 years after the last recorded occupancy. The tax lapse had proceeded through the standard county process without apparent urgency. Nobody had been pushing for resolution. Nobody had been waiting for the property, and the county had held it with the patient disinterest of an institution managing an asset that was not causing problems. Nora had paid more than the opening bid and less than she had budgeted, and she had driven to Crestfall Farm that same afternoon with her measuring tape and her notepad and the particular focused attention of someone who had been thinking about a place for 2 weeks and was finally able to look at it directly. The farmhouse was better than she had expected. That was the first thing better than 65 years of abandonment had any right to produce. The porch boards were weathered, but not rotted, the kind of weathering that came from exposure rather than neglect. The windows were intact throughout except for one pane on the east side of the ground floor, replaced at some point with a piece of plywood cut to size and fitted cleanly. Not the work of a storm, the work of someone who had noticed a broken pane and addressed it. She went through the ground floor, first the habit of someone who established the complete geography before examining any detail. The kitchen was clean, not recently occupied, but not deteriorated in the way of an abandoned space. The cast iron range was intact, the surface showing the particular patina of a piece that had been treated with oil at some point within living memory. She crouched and looked at the floor near the range, a section of boards perhaps 3 feet square that were slightly newer than the surrounding floor, the wood less darkened, the fit precise. Someone had replaced a section of the kitchen floor. Not recently, the replacement boards had aged enough to suggest the work was at least 20 years old, perhaps more. But someone had been here, had noticed a problem with the kitchen floor and had fixed it. She photographed it and wrote it in her notepad and moved on. The root cellar door at the back of the kitchen opened smoothly. The hinges oiled the resistance of a door that had been maintained rather than left to stiffen. She opened and closed it twice, confirming the quality of the movement, then left it for later. She spent 2 hours on the ground floor and the upper level measuring and photographing and noting. The house had been well built and had been intermittently maintained by someone who had access to it and had cared about its condition, and neither of those facts appeared in any record she had found. She went to the basement in the late afternoon. The stairs were steep and narrow, the handrail worn smooth at the grip from decades of the same hand descending in the same way. She went down with her flashlight and stood at the base of the stairs and let the space present itself. Stone walls on three sides, the rough, irregular fieldstone of a foundation laid in the 1890s, the lime mortar between the courses, the particular gray-white of a century's curing. The floor was packed earth. The ceiling was the underside of the kitchen floor above the joists, heavy and sound, the wood darkened with age. Cold, dry, the smell of stone and earth and the specific mineral quality of a sealed space. She walked the perimeter. The east wall, original fieldstone, the construction consistent with the other exposed sides. The west wall, the same. The north wall, the same, a section of shelving fixed to the stone, with iron brackets, the shelves empty and slightly dusty. She turned to the south wall. She stopped. 3 walls of rough, irregular fieldstone, the construction of the 1890s, the character of material that had been in place for more than a century, and 1 wall of brick. Not fieldstone brick. Machine-cut brick, the kind that became standard in the 1920s and 1930s, the edges sharper than handmade brick, the dimensions more consistent. The mortar between the courses was a different color from the fieldstone mortar, slightly warmer in tone, a different mix, the composition of a different era and a different hand. The courses were laid with a deliberateness that the original construction didn't have. The fieldstone foundation had been laid by people building for permanence, but the brick wall had been laid by someone building for something else, someone who had taken more care with the regularity of the courses than the situation strictly required. She walked to the joint where the brick wall met the original fieldstone of the east wall and ran her fingers along the seam. 2 different materials, 2 different eras. The fieldstone was cold and rough under her fingers. The brick was slightly smoother, the mortar at the joint a clean line, the work of someone who had fitted the newer material against the older with care. She stepped back and looked at the wall. 32 courses high, she estimated. She counted to confirm 32. The full height of the basement from floor to the underside of the kitchen above, and wide, she paced it. The full width of the south wall, end to end. Someone had built a complete interior wall across the full south face of this basement. She went back to her measuring tape. She had measured the kitchen above. She had the number in her notepad. She measured the basement north to south. She wrote the number down and looked at the 2 figures side by side. 9 feet. The basement was 9 feet shorter from north to south than the kitchen above it. 9 feet of the basement's original depth was on the other side of the brick wall. She stood at the base of the stairs and looked at the brick wall across the room. A retired librarian's training did not produce fear in this situation. It produced a specific kind of focused discomfort, the feeling she associated with a catalog record that contained internal contradictions with a filing system that had a gap where a gap should not be. Something did not correspond, and the non-correspondence was not accidental, and until she understood why the record was incomplete. She walked slowly to the south wall and began at the left end, working her way along the base course, with the flashlight reading the wall at floor level, the way she had learned to read the bottom shelves of an archive, the section people thought no one would look at. The mortar at the base of the wall was consistent throughout, the same mix, the same color, the same application. She moved the flashlight slowly, the beam at a low angle to reveal surface detail. She was near the right end of the wall, perhaps 8 inches from where the brick met the original fieldstone of the west wall when the light caught it. A small mark in the mortar joint between the second and third courses from the floor. She brought the flashlight close and looked at it directly. An X. Cut into the dried mortar with something narrow and pointed, not scratched carelessly, but pressed in deliberately, the strokes clean, and even the 2 lines of the mark crossing at a consistent angle. Small, perhaps a 1/4 inch across, the size of something made to be found by someone looking rather than seen by someone passing. Not a mason's mark. Mason's marks were on the stone face and served a functional purpose in the construction record. This mark was in the mortar joint at the base of the wall, in a position visible only from a low angle in good light. Cut after the mortar had dried by a hand that had returned to the finished wall with a specific intention. Someone had come back to this wall after it was built and had marked one brick near the floor on the right side. Had marked where to begin. Nora crouched in the basement of Crestfall Farm with the flashlight in her hand and looked at the small X in the mortar and understood that the gap in the record was not a gap. It was an instruction. If you believe that old houses hold what the people inside them couldn't say subscribe to follow this story all the way to the end. She drove to the County Historical Society the following morning. The archive occupied a converted room at the back of the county library, a space she had navigated before in other counties on other research projects, the particular institutional organization of a local historical collection that had grown by accumulation rather than design. The finding aids were handwritten in some sections and typed in others, the chronological coverage, uneven the depth of the holdings dependent on what individuals and organizations had chosen to donate across the decades. She gave the volunteer at the desk the date range she needed, 1950 through 1960 Whitmore family Crestfall Farm, and waited while the relevant boxes were located and brought to the reading table. The newspaper archive was the first box. She worked through the issues chronologically the way she always worked, beginning at the start of the decade and moving forward. The County Weekly had been publishing since 1897 and had covered local affairs with the particular thoroughness of a small-town paper that understood its readers were the subjects of its coverage: weddings, land transfers, agricultural reports, school news, the ordinary texture of a community's documented life. The Whitmore family appeared regularly through the 1940s and into the early 1950s Farm News, a mention of Gerald Whitmore on the County Agricultural Board, a notice of Edna Whitmore's teaching appointment at the elementary school in 1948. She read through these without finding anything that snagged until she reached the October 1952 issues. The article was on page 3. Not the front page, page 3 below the fold, the positioning of a story the editors had considered significant enough to cover, but not prominent enough to lead with. The headline was plain and declarative in the manner of rural weekly journalism. Thomas Cass farmhand abandons young family at Whitmore Farm. It was high. She read it carefully. Thomas Cass, employed as a farmhand at the Whitmore family property on County Road. 14 had left without notice or explanation, abandoning his wife, Edna, and their young son. Gerald Whitmore, Edna's brother and the farm's primary owner, had made himself available to the paper's reporter and had provided the account of the situation. Thomas had been a reliable worker for several years, but had shown in recent months signs of instability that the family had hoped would resolve themselves. They had not resolved. He had left. She read the article twice. No statement from Edna, no quotation from any neighbor or colleague or person who had known Thomas Cass in any capacity outside his employment at the Whitmore farm. No indication that the reporter had sought any account beyond Gerald Whitmore's. A single source, a single perspective, a single version of events presented without the attribution that would have made clear it was one person's account rather than established fact. She had seen this pattern before in the Crane Manor research, in other archive work, in 40 years of reading documents that had been produced with specific purposes by specific people in specific circumstances. A story with one source was not a story about what had happened. It was a story about what one person wanted on the record. She turned to the legal notices column in the same issue. A single entry, 4 lines, Whitmore farm deed clarified following family arrangement. No details. A deed matter settled within the family, recorded in the county's public notice requirements, but described with the minimum language required to satisfy them. She photographed both items and wrote the dates in her notepad. She moved forward 3 weeks in the archive. A brief notice in the personal announcements column. Edna Whitmore Cass had resumed use of her birth name, Edna Whitmore, effective the current date. No explanation, no context. A legal name change recorded in the public notice column in the same minimal language as the deed matter 3 weeks earlier. She spread the 3 documents on the reading table, the abandonment article, the deed, noticed the name change, and looked at them together. 6 weeks, 3 documents, each one closing a door. The abandonment article established Thomas Cass as the party who had left publicly on the record in the county newspaper, where it would be read by everyone who knew the family. The deed clarification established that the farm's ownership had been reorganized within the family in the weeks immediately following. The name change established that Edna had formally and legally severed her connection to Thomas Cass's name. Each document followed the previous one at intervals short enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Someone had understood the sequence required to accomplish a specific outcome and had moved through it quickly. She returned to the document boxes and asked for the county building permit records for 1952. The volunteer took longer with this request. The building permits were in a separate filing system organized by year and then alphabetically by applicant name. She waited at the reading table with her notepad and thought about the sequence she had laid out. The permit arrived in a manila folder, 1 page. Applicant G. Whitmore. Property, Whitmore Farm County Road, 14. Description of work cellar partition wall, interior non-load bearing. Materials common brick standard mortar, purpose storage division. Date of application, October 14th, 1952. She looked at her notepad where she had written the dates of the 3 newspaper items. The abandonment article, October 3, 1952. The deed clarification notice, October 17, 1952. The name change, October 24, 1952. The building permit, October 14, 1952. The wall had been permitted 11 days after the abandonment article and 3 days before the deed notice. Gerald Whitmore had moved through the newspaper account and the deed reorganization and the name change and the construction permit in a span of 3 weeks each step following the previous, with the efficiency of someone executing a plan rather than responding to events as they unfolded. She looked at the bottom of the permit for the contractor field. G. Whitmore self-submitted, no subcontractors listed. He had built the wall himself, had not hired a crew, had not brought in tradespeople from the next county the way Dorothea Kimball had done when she wanted workers with no connection to the district. Gerald Whitmore had obtained a public permit in his own name for work on his own property and had done the work himself. He had not hidden the construction. He had hidden what was behind it. She sat at the reading table with the 4 documents spread in front of her, the article, the deed, notice, the name change, the building permit, and looked at the dates running in sequence across 3 weeks of October, 1952. A farmhand publicly named as having abandoned his family. A farm deed reorganized within the family. A woman's name legally changed back to her birth name. And a wall built in a basement by a man who did the work himself and filed the permit under his own name. Gerald Whitmore had not tried to conceal the wall's existence. The permit was public record. Anyone who wanted to know that he had built a partition wall in his cellar in October 1952 could find out by asking the county. What he had built inside that permit, inside that legal and visible construction, that was the thing he had not disclosed. And at the lower right corner of the finished wall, pressed into the dried mortar, in a mark too small and too deliberate to be a mason's notation, someone had left a small X. Not Gerald. The X had been cut into mortar that had already dried left after the wall was finished by someone who had come back to it later, someone who knew where the wall was and what was behind it, and wanted the right person eventually to know where to begin. She closed her notepad. She had enough now to understand the shape of what had happened. She did not yet understand why. The why was behind the brick wall in the basement of Crestfall Farm, in whatever Gerald Whitmore had placed there in October 1952, and whatever someone else had marked with an X some time after. She thanked the volunteer and drove back to the farm. She called the contractor on a Monday morning. She had spent the weekend with the permit records and the newspaper archive photographs spread on the kitchen table of Crestfall Farm, working through the sequence of October 1952, the way she worked through any complicated cataloging problem, returning to it from different angles, following each document's implications to their logical end, making sure she understood the shape of what had happened before she disturbed the physical evidence of it. By Sunday evening, she was satisfied that she understood enough to proceed carefully and not enough to proceed without professional assistance. The firm she called was based in Columbus, a preservation contractor who specialized in historic structure work, whose website listed several county historical society commissions, and whose reputation, when she called two of the project contacts listed, was for meticulous documentation and minimal intervention. She explained the situation: a mid-century brick partition wall in a 1890s farmhouse basement, probable archival material behind it, the work to be done with full photographic documentation at each stage, and all removed material preserved and cataloged. The contractor arrived Wednesday morning with 2 assistants and equipment appropriate to careful work, not demolition tools, but conservation tools, the approach of people who understood that what they were removing was evidence and needed to be treated as evidence. Nora stood to the side and documented. The work proceeded from the marked X at the lower right corner, as she had indicated, starting at the instruction left in the mortar and working outward and upward, removing each brick individually, recording its position, before removal stacking the courses in sequence against the opposite wall. The mortar yielded without damage to the brick, the lime composition of the 1950s mix having cured to a hardness that held but released cleanly under careful application of the correct tools. The first opening appeared at the level of the third course. Nora stepped forward and held her flashlight into the gap. A space, not a room, not a passage. A recess built into the wall's depth, approximately 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and extending upward through the courses above. The walls of the recess were the original fieldstone of the basement's south foundation, undisturbed the surface, carrying the particular quality of stone that had been in darkness and stillness for decades. The floor of the recess was a single flat stone level intentionally placed. Across the middle of the recess, at approximately waist height, a wooden shelf. Simple construction, a single board. The wood dried but intact, supported at each end by iron brackets fixed into the fieldstone with cut nails. The shelf had been built into the recess before the brick wall was constructed over it, which meant it had been planned for the recess designed around the shelf designed around what would be placed on it. On the shelf, a tin box. Painted, the paint still present across most of the surface, the color a pale green that had faded toward gray in the areas of most exposure, but held its character in the protected sections. Approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, the depth perhaps 4 inches, a document storage box, the proportions appropriate for papers or photographs or small personal objects. A small padlock through the hasp on the front, the brass of the lock darkened to near black with age. On the lid, painted by hand in a color slightly darker than the box's base coat, a careful hand, the letters formed with attention to legibility rather than style, E.W. 2 initials, the same initials as the brass plate in the Crane Manor Library. She thought briefly, and then set the thought aside, because this was a different story, and the initials here meant something different. She photographed the box from above, from the front, from each side before she touched it. Then she crouched and looked at the underside of the shelf. Something was there. She could see it from this angle, a shape attached to the underside of the board. She leaned closer. A small object secured to the wood with a length of electrical tape, the tape dried to brittleness, the edges curled, and brown with age, the adhesion still holding after 70 years. A key, small, flat the bow, simple the barrel, short, a cabinet or padlock key, the scale appropriate to the lock on the box above it. She worked the tape free, carefully preserving it as much as the tape's condition allowed, and lifted the key from beneath the shelf. She held it and looked at the box. Gerald Whitmore had built this wall himself in October in 1952, over 3 weeks of documented construction work, filed under his own name with the county permit office. He had built a recess into the wall. He had placed a shelf in the recess. He had placed a locked box on the shelf, and he had taped the key to the underside of the shelf inside the wall, where it would be found by anyone who removed the brick and looked at the shelf from below. He had not locked the box and thrown away the key. He had locked it and kept the key inside the wall with it. The wall was not designed to be permanent. It was designed to be opened by someone willing to put in the work, willing to notice the X in the mortar, willing to understand what the X meant, willing to proceed carefully and document what they found. The key left inside changed the nature of the wall entirely. It was not a seal. It was a delay, a structure designed to slow down access rather than prevent it, to ensure that whoever opened the box had earned the opening through the specific effort of taking the wall apart brick by brick. Nora stood in the open recess with the key in her hand and the box on the shelf before her, and understood that Gerald Whitmore had been unable to destroy what was in the box and unwilling to leave it accessible, and had built the wall as the resolution to that specific conflict. She lifted the box from the shelf with both hands. It was heavier than she had expected, the density of paper, multiple documents, the weight of things that had been preserved rather than discarded. She carried it to the folding table she had set up against the north wall, her working surface, her lamp positioned for document examination. She set the box down and looked at the lid. E.W., the initials of someone who had been in this house, on this farm, whose name had been reorganized back to Whitmore in a county newspaper notice in October 1952. Edna Whitmore. She turned the box over before inserting the key. The underside of the box was plain, the same pale green paint, the same aged surface, except in the center where the paint had been broken by something sharp and narrow, the marks pressed into the metal with the point of a nail or a key or a tool whose purpose was not this purpose, not paint, not stencil, carved. 2 words and an initial. The hand was different from the painted initials on the lid, rougher, less controlled. The marks of someone working quickly or under pressure or in poor light, or working in a state of mind that did not allow for the patience the painted letters had required. God forgive me, G.W. Nora read it once. She read it again. She set the box on the table and sat down in the folding chair she had brought to the basement for this work, and looked at the carved words on the metal bottom of a box that a man had sealed inside a wall he had built himself and marked with a small X, so that someone would eventually find it. Gerald Whitmore had locked the box and kept the key and built the wall and pressed an X into the dried mortar and written "God forgive me" on the bottom before he closed everything up. He had not been able to destroy it. He had not been able to leave it findable without effort. He had left the key inside and the instruction on the outside of the mortar and the confession on the bottom of the box, and he had built the wall across all of it and gone upstairs and lived the rest of his life above it. Nora picked up the key. She inserted the key into the padlock. The mechanism resisted not from damage, but from the particular stiffness of a lock that had been closed for 70 years in a sealed space, and had not been asked to move since. She worked it the way she had always worked, with archival materials that resisted without force, with patience, applying steady pressure and releasing it and applying it again, until the mechanism found its way back to the function it had been made for. The lock opened. She lifted the hasp and set the padlock on the table beside the box. She put on her examination gloves, the linen gloves she carried in her kit, the ones she used for primary source materials, and opened the lid. The smell that came up was the smell she associated with well-preserved documents in a sealed container paper, and time, and the particular dryness of a space that had been protected from moisture. The cedar smell she sometimes encountered in document chests was not here. This was simpler. The smell of a tin box and old paper and nothing else. She looked at the contents before touching anything. 5 distinct items arranged in the box with the care of someone who had organized them deliberately, each one positioned to be encountered in a specific order. She photographed the interior of the box exactly as it had been found, the items in their positions, before she removed anything. Then she began. The first item was a document folded twice the paper firm and slightly yellowed but fully intact. She unfolded it carefully and spread it flat on the table under the examination lamp. A marriage certificate. Ohio, 1941, the standard state form of the period, the fields completed in the official hand of a county clerk. She read the names in the principal fields: Edna Louise Whitmore and Thomas Arthur Cass. The date, June 14, 1941. The county, the same county as Crestfall Farm. The seal present, the notary's impression still clear. Witness signatures, too, both legible. Legal in every respect. A valid marriage documented and witnessed and certified 11 years before the newspaper article that had named Thomas Cass as a man who had abandoned his family. She set it at the top left of her working space and reached for the second item. A single folded sheet, handwritten, the paper heavier than the marriage certificate, the kind of paper used for legal documents, the weight of something meant to carry significance. She unfolded it and read, "A handwritten deed addendum, dated 1948, signed by Alfred Whitmore, the patriarch. She had found his name in the county records, Edna and Gerald's father." The language was plain and specific, the sentences of a man who was not a lawyer, but who understood what he was trying to say, and had said it without ambiguity. The farm, Crestfall Farm on County Road 14, was to pass upon Alfred's death to his daughter, Edna Louise. Whitmore Cass, not to be divided or transferred without her consent, the entire property to remain in her name and under her direction. Not Gerald's name, Edna's. 2 witness signatures at the bottom, different from the marriage certificate, witnesses, neighbors. She guessed the names familiar from the county records she had reviewed. The document was handwritten and unrecorded, which raised questions about its legal standing, but its existence was unambiguous. Alfred Whitmore had wanted Edna to have the farm and had written it down and had it witnessed. She placed it beside the marriage certificate. The third item was a photograph. She lifted it with both hands, a standard print from the early 1940s, the surface slightly glossy, the image in the warm sepia tones of the period. 3 people on the front porch of Crestfall Farm. She recognized the porch from her first day on the property, the same boards, the same railing post at the right edge of the frame. A woman on the left, dark-haired, her posture, that of someone at home in the place she was standing. A man on the right, taller, his arm slightly extended toward the woman in a gesture that had not quite completed itself before the photograph was taken. And between them, held in the crook of the woman's left arm, a baby, round-faced and serious-looking at the camera, with the solemn attention of an infant who had not yet learned to perform for a lens. She turned the photograph over. Edna, Tom, and Danny, first summer, 1942. The handwriting was careful and neat, the hand of someone who wrote with attention to legibility, who understood that what was written on the back of a photograph was the record that would accompany the image when the faces were no longer immediately recognizable. A teacher's hand. She set the photograph beside the 2 documents. The 4th item was wrapped in a piece of muslin cloth folded neatly around something small. She unwrapped it. A child's shoe. Brown leather, the kind of sturdy, practical footwear made for a toddler in the early 1940s. The leather stiff with age, the sole worn slightly at the toe, in the way of a shoe that had been walked in before it was stored. Size 4. She turned it over and looked at the inside of the upper where the leather lining met the tongue. Written in black ink in careful printed letters, Daniel. She set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. A single shoe. One of a pair, presumably, but only one in the box. The other half of a matched pair somewhere else, or gone entirely the way things separated over time and circumstance. She picked up the final item. 12 letters folded individually, tied together with kitchen twine that had dried to brittleness. She worked the knot loose without untying it, preserving the twine, and spread the letters on the table in the order they had been tied, the sequence in which they had been arranged, which she understood was the sequence in which they had arrived, or in which they had been organized by whoever had placed them here. She opened the first letter, Columbus, Ohio, March 1952. The handwriting was confident and clear, the letters upright, and evenly spaced, the hand of a man who wrote with the assurance of someone who expected to be read. He did not understand the silence. He had written 3 times and received no reply. He was not angry, the tone was careful, measured the tone of a man trying to be reasonable in a situation he could not fully read. He asked about Daniel. He asked whether Edna was well. He asked whether there was something he had done that he could address if she would tell him what it was. She folded it and opened the second letter. July 1952. He had come to the farm. Gerald had met him at the gate and told him Edna did not wish to have contact. He had asked to see Daniel. Gerald had said this was not possible. He had left. He wrote, "I don't know what I've done. I would like the chance to hear it from Edna, not from Gerald." She read through the sequence. 1953, still writing the tone, still measured the hope, still present, but slightly reduced the letters of a man who was beginning to understand that something had been decided about him without his participation. 1955. He asked only about Daniel's schooling, whether he was well, whether the farm was managing. 1958. He had stopped asking about Edna entirely. The letters now were about Daniel, only the specific, careful questions of a father who had accepted that he would not be answered, but could not stop asking. She opened the 11th letter. 1963. The handwriting had changed. Not dramatically, the same letter forms, the same basic character, but smaller. The letters compressed the lines, spacing reduced the pressure on the page, less certain. The writing of someone who had been doing this for 11 years and was running out of the confidence that the doing of it required. She opened the 12th letter. 1965. The handwriting was smaller still, the lines slightly uneven, the words of a man who was writing from a diminished place. I've stopped writing now. I don't know what I did wrong. I hope Daniel is well. I hope he knows I tried to find him. She set the letter flat on the table. She did not immediately reach for the next thing. She sat in the chair she had brought to the basement for this work and looked at the 12 letters arranged in sequence and thought about the particular accumulation they represented, not a single dramatic moment, but 13 years of monthly or quarterly or annual attempts to reach through a wall that had been constructed around him without his knowledge, each letter slightly smaller and less certain than the one before it. The confidence of a man being slowly reduced by sustained silence until there was nothing left to reduce. She picked up the 1965 letter again to fold it for storage.
And saw it!
In the left margin in pencil, faint, partially erased, but not fully the ghost of a word, still present in the indentation of the paper, even where the graphite had been removed. One word. Written in a hand that was not Thomas Cass's hand, the letter forms different, the pressure different, the angle different.
Enough!
Partially erased, written and then reconsidered and taken back, but not taken back fully enough to disappear. Gerald Whitmore had read this letter before he placed it in the box. Had read all 12 of them. She understood this now, the sequence made complete. He had read them and had written one word in the margin of the last one, and had thought better of it and had erased it and had placed the letters in the box with the marriage certificate and the deed addendum and the photograph and the child's shoe, and had locked it and taped the key to the underside of the shelf and built the wall across all of it. And then he had carved "God forgive me" on the bottom of the box before he closed everything up. He had read 12 letters from a man trying to find his son and had written enough in the margin of the last one and had sealed the box and built the wall. Thomas wrote 12 letters over 13 years. Not one reached the person they were meant for. If you were Daniel right now, what's the first thing you'd want to know? Leave your answer below. She spent the following morning at the kitchen table of Crestfall Farm with her laptop and the county public records access she had set up during her initial research. Thomas Arthur Cass, Columbus, Ohio. She had the name from the marriage certificate, the city from the letters. She worked through the available databases with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 4 decades locating materials that had been imperfectly cataloged, the vital records, the county death indexes, the digitized newspaper archives. She found him in 40 minutes. Ohio death record 1970. Thomas Arthur Cass, male, age 54. Occupation construction worker. Cause of death industrial accident construction site. County of death Franklin, which encompassed Columbus. Date March 19, 1970. No next of kin listed. She read the field twice. In 1970, the next of kin field on an Ohio death record was filled in by whoever reported the death, a supervisor, a co-worker, a hospital administrator, working from whatever identification the deceased carried. No next of kin listed meant that Thomas Cass had died without anyone who could be named. No obituary appeared in the Columbus newspaper archive for the week of March 19, 1970, or the following week. She expanded the search to the month and found nothing. A man who had worked construction in Columbus for at least 18 years, the letters ran from 1952 to 1965, each one headed with a Columbus address, had died in an industrial accident and had not generated an obituary. She sat with this for a moment. He had died in 1975, years after writing the final letter. The letter in which he had written, "I've stopped writing now. I don't know what I did wrong. I hope Daniel is well. I hope he knows I tried to find him." He had died not knowing that the letters had not arrived, had died believing that Edna had chosen not to respond, and Daniel had grown up without curiosity about a father who had, as far as anyone had told him, simply walked away, had died carrying the specific, unanswerable grief of a man who did not know what he had done wrong and had no mechanism for finding out. Nora wrote the death record information in her notepad, wrote the date, wrote "no next of kin" listed, and drew a line under it. Then she turned to the search for Daniel. Daniel Cass, the name from the marriage certificate. Or possibly Daniel Whitmore. She had no record of whether he had kept his father's name or taken his mother's after 1952. She searched both. Daniel Cass returned a sparse trail, a school enrollment in the county records from the mid-1950s, an address associated with Crestfall Farm. Then nothing, the trail going cold, as it often did for individuals who moved and changed circumstances in the pre-digital era. She tried Daniel Whitmore and found less. She broadened the search obituaries, the kind that appeared in small regional papers, and mentioned family members by name. She was working through the Ohio newspaper database when she found it not Daniel's obituary, but his wife's. Dorothy Mae Cass, née Hollander of Dayton, Ohio, died 2019, survived by her husband Daniel Cass, 81, of Dayton, and their daughter Ruth Ann Cass, 61, also of Dayton, and 2 grandchildren. She had a name, she had a city, she had an age. Daniel would be 84 now if he was still living. She called the Dayton directory and then the county social services line and explained carefully that she was trying to locate a family member in connection with a historical property matter. The social services contact was patient and precise, and after 20 minutes of navigation gave her the name of a memory care facility in the eastern part of Dayton, where a Daniel Cass had been a resident for 3 years. She called the facility. The staff member who answered was professionally cautious. She understood the caution, had encountered it before. In this kind of research, the appropriate guardedness of people responsible for vulnerable adults. She asked to speak with a family contact, explaining that she had information about a property matter that related to Mr. Cass's family history. The staff member took her name and number and said she would have someone return the call. Ruth Cass called back within the hour. Her voice was the voice of a woman in her 60s who had learned caution from experience, careful, attentive, the particular quality of someone who had been managing difficult situations for long enough that careful was now her baseline. She identified herself as Daniel's daughter and asked what this was about. Nora explained as clearly as she could. The farmhouse, the sealed wall, the tin box, the marriage certificate, the deed addendum, the photograph, the letters. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "We were told Thomas walked out in 1952. My father never talked about it much, just that his father left." A pause. "He had a hard time with it when he was younger, the not knowing why. He stopped asking questions about it eventually, or stopped asking out loud." The letters, Nora said. Thomas wrote 12 letters over 13 years, from 1952 through 1965. 12 letters. One a year, roughly, sometimes more in the early years. The last one is from 1965. He wrote that he had stopped writing. He said he didn't know what he had done wrong. He asked that Daniel be told he had tried to find him. Ruth did not respond immediately. Nora waited. "Where were the letters?" Ruth asked finally. "In the sealed section of the basement, in the tin box, with the marriage certificate and a photograph of your father as an infant with both his parents, and a child's shoe with your father's name written inside it." She heard Ruth's breathing change. "A shoe," Ruth said. "Brown leather, child size 4, Daniel written in black ink on the inside." The line was quiet for a long moment. When Ruth spoke again, her voice had changed, still controlled, but carrying something underneath the control, now something that was working its way through. "My father has a box in his room at the facility, a shoe box, the cardboard kind. He keeps one thing in it. He's kept it for as long as I can remember, moved it from every house and apartment to the next, always the box, always the same thing inside. Nora said nothing. An old child's shoe, Ruth said. Brown leather. He's never explained it. Not once, not to anyone. He just has it. When he was more himself before the memory issues got worse, I asked him about it once. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said it needs its other half. She stopped. Nora looked at the shoe on the table in front of her, the single brown leather shoe size 4, Daniel written in careful black ink on the inside of the upper. He talks to it sometimes, Ruth said. The shoe. In the last couple of years when it's not a good day, he takes it out of the box and holds it. I always thought it was the dementia. I thought he had attached significance to a random object the way people sometimes do. A pause. I didn't know it was memory. Nora looked at the shoe and thought about a man who had been told his father had walked away, who had carried a child's shoe for 70 years in a cardboard box through every move and transition of his life, who had held it on the bad days and told his daughter it needed its other half. He had known. Not consciously, not in the way that could be articulated to a daughter who asked, but somewhere in the knowledge that the body carries without permission, in the part of understanding that lives below the stories people tell you about your own life. He had known that the shoe in his box was one of 2, and that the other one was somewhere he had not been able to reach. Thomas wrote 12 letters over 13 years, and not one reached the person they were meant for. If you were Daniel right now, what's the first thing you'd want to know? Leave your answer below. Ruth met her in the facility parking lot on a Thursday afternoon in October. She was 61 years old, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been managing difficult situations for long enough that the managing had become her default posture, competent, attentive, the kind of person who arrived 5 minutes early and had already spoken to the staff on duty and knew which room they were going to, and what the afternoon had been like for her father. She shook Nora's hand with the directness of someone who had decided to trust a stranger, because the alternative was worse than the risk. Today is a good day, she said. He recognized me this morning. He asked about the weather and told me a story about the parking lot at his old hardware store. Those are good signs. Nora said she understood and would follow Ruth's lead entirely. They went inside. The facility was clean and quiet, in the manner of places that had learned to manage the particular kind of quiet that was respectful rather than institutional. The staff moved without urgency. The hallways were well lit. The rooms they passed had the personal objects of the people who lived in them visible on shelves and windowsills, the photographs and small items that continued to mean something, even when larger meanings had become harder to hold. Daniel's room was at the end of the east corridor. He was sitting at the small table by the window when they came. In a tall man, even seated the frame of someone who had done physical work for most of his life. The shoulders slightly rounded now with age, but the structure still present underneath. His hair was white and thin, his hands on the table large and still. He looked up when Ruth entered, and his face changed in the way faces change when they recognize someone genuinely, and not by effort, a real recognition, immediate and warm. "There she is," he said. His voice was steady, the voice of a man whose physical self had held better than some things. Ruth kissed him on the cheek and sat in the chair across from him, and introduced Nora as someone who had found something that belonged to his family. Daniel looked at Nora with the careful attention of someone managing a world that sometimes moved too quickly and had learned to assess new elements before committing to a response. "You found something," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "At Crestfall Farm, your mother's family's property." He looked at the window for a moment. The October light came through at a low angle, crossing the table between them. Ruth reached into the bag she had brought and took out the photograph. She set it on the table in front of Daniel without saying anything, the way Nora had placed the pocket watch in front of Owen Parrish, letting the object arrive, before the words giving it the space to be received directly. Daniel looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He sat with his hand still on the table and looked at the photograph from the distance at which it had been placed, reading it the way you read something you are not yet sure you want to be closer to. Then he picked it up. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The summer porch light, Edna on the left, Thomas on the right, the baby in the crook of Edna's arm looking at the camera with the serious attention of a very young child. His hands were steady on the photograph. He turned it over. She watched him read the inscription on the back, the careful, neat hand of a teacher who understood that the back of a photograph was the record that would remain when the faces were no longer immediately recognizable. Edna, Tom, and Danny. First summer, 1942. He set the photograph face down on his knee and looked out the window. "That's my father," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "I know that man." Ruth leaned forward slightly. "He didn't leave you, Dad." Daniel did not respond immediately. He kept his eyes on the window, the October light on the glass, the parking lot, and the trees beyond it, doing what they always did, regardless of what was happening at the table by the window. Ruth took the final letter from the folder Nora had brought. The 1965 letter, Thomas's last, the handwriting, at its smallest and most uncertain, the words of a man who had been reduced by 13 years of sustained silence to the specific grief of not knowing what he had done wrong. She read it aloud. Her voice was steady throughout the steadiness of someone who had decided before she came into this room that she would read it clearly, regardless of what it cost her to do so. She read the letter the way it had been written, plainly, without performance, the words doing the work they had been written to do. "I've stopped writing now. I don't know what I did wrong. I hope Daniel is well. I hope he knows I tried to find him." The room was quiet for a moment. Daniel said he tried. 2 words, said in the same quiet, even voice as everything else, without drama, without the emphasis of a revelation. The words of a man receiving a confirmation of something he had needed to know for 70 years, and receiving it now with the particular quality of someone for whom the need had not diminished with age, had simply waited patient and unchanged for the information that would finally answer it. Ruth reached to the shelf beside the bed and took down the shoebox, the cardboard kind worn at the corners from years of handling the lid, slightly misshapen from many openings and closings. She brought it to the table and took off the lid and set it beside the tin box Nora had brought from the farm. Inside the shoebox, a single child's shoe. Brown leather, the surface worn with age, the toe slightly scuffed in the way of a shoe that had been walked in by a small child before it was stored. She lifted it out and set it on the table beside the shoe from the tin box. Same size, same construction, same period. The leather of different ages now, the one from the tin box protected in a sealed space for 70 years, the one from the shoebox handled across 70 years of daily proximity, but unmistakably from the same pair. The same maker's stamp on the sole, the same cut of the upper, the same small detail of stitching at the toe. Nora looked at the 2 shoes side by side on the table. 2 halves of a pair separated in 1952 and kept for 70 years by 2 different people. With no way of knowing the other half, still existed a man in a memory care facility in Dayton carrying the question of the missing shoe through every move and transition of his life, and a tin box in a sealed wall in a farmhouse basement, holding the answer in the dark. Daniel reached out and picked up the shoe from the tin box. He turned it over and looked at the inside where Daniel was written in black ink. He looked at it for a long time. The particular looking of someone who was reading something they had always known, was written somewhere, had spent 70 years knowing it was written somewhere, and had finally found the page. He set it down carefully beside the shoe from his box. The 2 shoes side by side, the pair complete for the first time since October 1952. He said, "Your grandmother kept the other one. I always wondered." He said it in the same quiet voice as everything else, not as a discovery, as the resolution of a question that had been open for 70 years. He had always known there was another shoe. He had carried the knowledge the way you carry things that have no resolution available, not forgotten, not resolved, just present part of the interior landscape of a life unnamed and persistent. Ruth looked at the 2 shoes on the table and then at her father. The afternoon light moved across the table in the slow way of late October light that does not hurry and does not stay. Thomas wrote 12 letters in 13 years, and not one reached the person they were meant for. If this moment moved, you press like it helps this story find the people who need to hear it. Nora gave Ruth the address and stayed behind. She had understood from the quality of Ruth's silence on the drive back from the facility that the next part of this belonged to Ruth alone. The farmhouse had been Nora's discovery, Nora's research, Nora's careful documentation. But what was in the basement was not Nora's. It had never been Nora's. She had been the instrument of its finding, which was a different thing from ownership, and she had learned the difference well enough in 40 years of archival work to know when to step back. Ruth drove out the following morning. She drove the county road alone with the October fields on either side, going to their autumn colors and the address written in her notepad on the passenger seat, though she had memorized it by the time she had driven 10 miles. She had spent the previous evening at the facility sitting with her father, after Nora left the 2 shoes on the table between them for a long time before the staff came to prepare him for dinner. Daniel had held both shoes in his lap for most of that time, not speaking the particular stillness of someone who had been given something they had waited for long enough that receiving it required the whole of their attention. She had driven back to her hotel and had sat at the small desk and had not been able to sleep until very late. Now she turned off the county road onto the lane and parked at the end where the gravel gave way to the overgrown grass of the farm's approach and sat in the car for a moment looking at the farmhouse. White clapboard, 2 stories, the old maple at the southeast corner, the porch running across the front. The same porch in the photograph that was now in her bag, the one she had carried from the facility with Daniel's quiet permission, the one that showed Edna and Thomas and a baby in the summer light of 1942, the summer before everything that followed. She got out of the car and went inside. The kitchen, the cast iron range, the section of newer boards in the floor near the range, the patch someone had made at some point in the farmhouse's long supervised vacancy. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about Edna Whitmore teaching school and coming home to this kitchen and what the kitchen had meant to her before October 1952 and what it had meant after. She went to the basement door and descended. The basement was as Nora had left it after the contractor's work. The south wall opened the brick courses stacked against the north wall. In their careful documented sequence, the dust of the demolition settled into the packed earth floor. The recess was fully visible now, the 3 walls of original fieldstone surrounding the wooden shelf and the empty space where the tin box had sat for 70 years. Ruth crossed the basement floor and stood in front of the open recess. She ran her hand along the remaining brick of the right side, the courses that had framed the recess, the brick that had constituted the wall's edge. The mortar was rough under her fingers, slightly gritty, the texture of material that had been mixed and applied by hand. She thought about Gerald Whitmore in this basement in October 1952, laying these courses himself, 1 brick at a time, building the wall that would separate the recess from the rest of the basement and from the world above it. He had been alone. The permit listed no subcontractors. No one had helped him. She stepped into the recess and looked at the shelf. The wooden board was still in place, still supported by its iron brackets, fixed into the fieldstone, the wood dried to the pale gray of old timber. She looked at the underside of the shelf where Nora had described the key. The electrical tape brittle and curled, the adhesive dried to a brown residue on the wood. She ran her finger along the residue, tracing the outline of where the tape had been. Gerald had locked the box and placed it on the shelf and taped the key to the underside and built the wall across all of it. She picked up the tin box from where Nora had set it on the shelf after examining the contents. It was lighter than she had expected, the way objects were always lighter than the weight of what they contained. She turned it over in her hands. The painted initials on the lid, E.W., in the pale green paint that had faded toward gray. Her grandmother's initials, painted by someone she assumed Gerald before the box was placed on the shelf and the wall was closed. She turned the box over. The inscription was exactly as Nora had described it, pressed into the metal with something narrow and sharp, the marks uneven in the way of someone working quickly, or in uncertain light, or in a state that did not allow for care. God forgive me, G.W. She looked at it for a long time. 3 words and an initial, not written for anyone to find, or not written primarily for anyone to find. Written in the way that people write things when they need to say them somewhere that will hold them when there is no one available to say them to, when the saying is the point regardless of whether it is received. Gerald Whitmore had pressed these words into the bottom of a tin box before he sealed it in a wall. He built himself in a basement he entered alone, in a farmhouse he would leave in 1959 without explanation and never return to. He had not written it as a confession for a future reader. He had written it as the honest transaction of a man speaking to something larger than himself, or to the box, or to the people whose lives he had organized into a shape they had not chosen. Ruth thought about what she knew of Gerald Whitmore. He had been the one to speak to the newspaper. His account had appeared under the headline that had defined Thomas Cass for everyone who read it in October 1952. He had met Thomas at the farm gate and sent him away. He had filed the building permit and laid the brick and taped the key to the underside of the shelf and built the wall. He had not destroyed the letters. She kept returning to this. He had read them. The penciled word in the margin of the last one, partially erased, was evidence of that. He had read 12 letters from a man trying to reach his son and his wife, and he had not burned them. He had not torn them up. He had placed them in the box with the marriage certificate and the deed addendum and the photograph and the child's shoe, and he had locked it and kept the key and built the wall. He could have burned the box, could have buried it in the fields, dropped it in the creek, disposed of it in any of the ways that a man alone on a farm in 1952 could have disposed of a small tin box. No one would have known. No one would have looked. He had not done any of those things. He had built a wall with a key inside it. She looked at the place where the key had been taped under the shelf. Not hidden in any real sense. Hidden in the way that something is hidden when the person who hides it understands that the hiding is not permanent, that it is a delay rather than a conclusion. The key taped under the shelf was not the action of a man who wanted the box to remain sealed forever. It was the action of a man who needed it sealed for now, for the length of his own life perhaps, or for as long as the circumstances that had required the sealing remained unchanged, and who could not bring himself to make the sealing permanent. He had marked the wall with an X in the dried mortar. He had left the key inside. Ruth stood in the recess in the basement of Crestfall Farm with the tin box in her hands and looked at the inscription on its bottom and said not to anyone in particular, not to any audience she was aware of, "You kept the key inside." Her voice was quiet in the low-ceilinged space, the sound absorbed by the stone and the packed earth and the old wood of the shelf above her. "You knew someone would find it." She looked at the place where the key had been, the dried tape residue, the outline of a small object held against the wood for 70 years, against the possibility of exactly this. She held the tin box against her chest and looked at the recess for a moment longer, the fieldstone walls, the careful iron brackets, the shelf that had held the box in the dark, since October 1952. Then she turned and carried the box up the stairs through the kitchen and out into the October morning. The County Historical Society received the donation on a Friday morning in November. Nora had arranged it through contacts she had maintained across 20 years of archival work, the kind of professional relationships that made institutional processes move more smoothly than they otherwise would. The Society's acquisitions director was a woman she had worked with on 2 previous projects, careful and thorough, the kind of archivist who understood that provenance documentation was as important as the objects themselves. Nora had prepared the provenance file over 2 weeks, the complete record of the discovery, the structural contractor's documentation of the wall removal, the chain of custody from the moment the tin box was lifted from the shelf to the moment it was delivered to the Society's care. The contents were processed in the order they had been found. The marriage certificate, First Ohio, 1941, Edna Louise Whitmore and Thomas Arthur Cass, notarized and witnessed and legally valid in every respect. Filed in an archival sleeve labeled in the acquisition system, the record noting that it was the documentation of a marriage that had been publicly characterized as an abandonment in the county newspaper, of October 1952. The deed addendum, Alfred Whitmore's handwritten instruction dated 1948, witnessed expressing his intention that Crestfall Farm pass to his daughter Edna rather than his son Gerald. Nora had consulted a property attorney before the donation. The news was what she had expected. The statute of limitations had passed. The subsequent deed transfers had created a chain of title that could not be unwound. Gerald had been dead since 1989. The addendum had no legal force that could be exercised now. But it was a document. It said what it said. Alfred Whitmore had written down what he wanted for his daughter and had signed it and had it witnessed, and that intention was now part of the public historical record of the county, permanently and accessibly filed in the Society's collection, where anyone who wanted to understand the complete history of Crestfall Farm and the Whitmore family could find it and read it. That was what the historical record was for. The photograph was processed third Edna and Thomas and baby Daniel on the porch of Crestfall Farm, summer 1942, the handwriting on the back in Edna's careful teacher's hand. A copy was made for the Society's collection. The original Ruth had taken back to Dayton, where it was now in a simple wooden frame on the table beside Daniel's chair in the memory care facility. He touched the frame when he passed it, the staff had told Ruth. Not always consciously, sometimes it seemed more like the automatic gesture of someone reaching for something they had learned was reliably there. He did not always remember why, but his hand went to the frame, and the frame held the photograph, and the photograph showed Thomas Cass in the summer light of 1942 on the porch of a farm he had worked and a life he had been removed from. The 12 letters were filed last, each one in its own archival sleeve, the sleeves arranged chronologically in a document folder, the folder labeled with Thomas Cass's name, and the date range and the notation that these were letters written by Thomas Arthur Cass of Columbus, Ohio, between 1952 and 1965, addressed to his wife, Edna Whitmore Cass, at Crestfall Farm, and never delivered. The acquisitions record noted the penciled word in the margin of the 1965 letter, partially erased, still present in the indentation of the paper, and identified it as a different hand from the letter's author. The single word preserved in the record enough. The tin box itself was accessioned as a separate object, the painted initials on the lid, the carved inscription on the bottom. God forgive me. G.W. The Society's documentation recorded both the physical description and the transcription without interpretation. The objects said what they said. The record did not need to explain them. Ruth had driven back to Dayton with the photograph and the 2 shoes. The shoes were in a small glass-fronted box on the shelf in her sitting room, the kind of box used for displaying objects too significant for ordinary handling, too important to be put away in a drawer where they could not be seen. Both shoes together side by side, the child's brown leather of 2 halves, of a pair that had been separated in October 1952 and reunited 70 years later in a memory care facility in Dayton. Not rejoined, side by side. The scuff on the toe of Daniel's shoe, worn in by a child learning to walk. The cleaner surface of the shoe from the tin box protected in the sealed space. The same size, the same maker's stamp, the same cut of the upper, the same name written inside both of them, Daniel, in the black ink of a mother who had understood that small shoes needed to be labeled before they were separated from their pair. They were not separated anymore. Daniel had touched both shoes on the afternoon they were placed together the way he had touched the photograph frame in the days since. He did not always know what he was touching. He knew something. Whatever was below the surface of a story you had been told about your own life, whatever lodged in the body rather than the memory, in the knowledge that persisted when the narratives organized around it had become unreliable. He knew something, and the knowing was in his hands when he touched the shoes, and it was enough.
It was not everything.
Thomas Cass had died in Columbus in March 1970, believing that his wife had chosen not to respond, and his son had grown up without wanting to find him. He had died not knowing the letters had been intercepted. He had died carrying the specific diminishment of 13 years of unanswered correspondence, each letter written smaller than the last, the confidence of a man slowly reduced by sustained silence. He had died without knowing the reason for the silence. That could not be returned to him. The record could be corrected. The correction could not reach him. Edna had died in 1978, 26 years after October, 1952, after the newspaper article, and the deed reorganization, and the name change, and the brick wall in the basement. What she had known, or believed, or suspected in those 26 years Nora had not been able to determine. Whether Gerald had told her the truth at some point, or whether she had lived those years with the story she had been given about Thomas, the story of a man who had walked away, that was a question the record could not answer. Some things were not in the record. Some things had been carried in silence and had not been written down. Nora drove back to her own house in late November, the farmhouse transferred to the County Historical Society's preservation program, the commission complete. She had been a librarian for 40 years, and she understood the limits of what records could do. They could make visible what had been hidden. They could correct the version that had been installed in the public account. They could ensure that the right information was findable by anyone who came looking. They could not recover the years. They could not give Thomas the knowledge that his letters had been read by his son. They could not give Edna back the farm her father had intended for her, or the marriage that had been publicly dissolved before she could speak. They could not give Daniel 80 years of the story that should have been his. They could make the true version part of the permanent record. That was what they had done. Gerald Whitmore had built that wall himself, no subcontractors, no witnesses. He had built it to last, and he had left the key inside it. Perhaps he thought someone would find it in 5 years. Perhaps he thought it would be 100. He left no letter, no explanation, no account of why he had done what he had done, or what he had believed he was protecting, or what he had hoped would happen when the wall was eventually opened. Only 3 words on the bottom of a tin box, and a key taped where it could be found. Some people cannot destroy the truth even when they spend a lifetime building walls around it. The next story is waiting for you. Another house, another wall, another truth that waited longer than it should have. It's in the playlist right here.